Welcome to Unsolved History. On the doorstep of MLK 50, we are taking a look back at the deaths of Martin Luther King Jr. and his brother, Alfred Daniel King. While the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is well documented, a spiritual leader and public negotiator for the 1960s civil rights movement, little is known about his brother, A.D. King, who apparently, depressed with grief, drank himself to death and drowned in his own swimming pool. Or at least, that's the story we've come to know. Was his death an accident or murder? I'm Ed Gordon. We'll tackle that question on this edition of Unsolved History, Life of a King. On January 6, 2018, the family gathered for the burial of Isaac Newton Ferris Sr., founding member of the King Center and the brother-in-law of Martin Luther King Jr. and Alfred Daniel King.
My mother's generation in her family was robbed. You all know 1968, Brooklyn Mills assassination. 1 year later, not as well known, her other brother, Uncle A.D., was taken from us. And he was taken from us. We don't talk about it much, but he was taken from us.
Moments following the funeral, we were able to sit down with A.D.'s oldest daughter, Alveda King, who is still haunted by her father's death.
So we kind of expected that they could go at any time. And I believe Daddy and Uncle and Mel knew that.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
In 2018, and moving forward into the next decades and generations for the young people, truth has to be told. And as painful as truth can be, when we have the answers, then we know how to move forward.
From a young age, the King brothers were groomed for ministry and leadership by their father, Martin Luther King Sr., and their grandfather, Alfred Daniel Williams, who A.D. was named after. Growing up, the two brothers were always side by side, even in Memphis, on April 4th, 1968, the day of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination.
The last afternoon before Dr. King was killed, he and A.D. were having a fish luncheon together. So we were all clowning and playing around, and it was one of the happiest times in the movement for me because they started beating me up with a pillow. And I made the mistake of throwing the pillow back at them. And then everybody just got the pillows and piled on top of me in between the two beds in the Lorraine Motel. But it was just a fun time. And then somebody knocked on the door and said, you know, you all are due for dinner at 6 o'clock. And Martin went upstairs to put on his shirt and tie to go to dinner. And next thing we knew, a shot was ringing out.
Reverend A.D. was in the room directly below Martin Luther King Jr. when the fatal shot went off.
My husband was there right there in Memphis, Tennessee, right there with him, right by his side, as he always was. He was right there near his side. And the next day, you had all of these figures was mentioned, everybody there was there, but him. Now why, how could you overlook his brother, his only brother? How could you call everybody else's name, and overlook his only brother? That is very painful to me, and I would imagine this, was very painful for him.
In the spring of 1965, at that time, at a meeting of the executive board in Baltimore, Maryland, Dr. King and the members of the board unanimously agreed that in the event of Dr. King's death, Dr. Abernathy would become the president.
There was speculation that AD might become president of the SCLC. However, AD made no attempts to assume the role, instead focusing on finding the truth about the assassination of his brother.
Have you gentlemen had any progress report or any late information on the search for the assassin?
No, nothing more than what we've read in the papers.
AD was determined to get to the bottom of who killed his brother. He knew more than perhaps he should have known about his brother's death, and was determined to try to keep the issue alive. And maybe he was simply too close to the target. He was too much online.
July 21st, 1969, Alfred Daniel King would be discovered dead in his own swimming pool. His daughter, Alveda, remembers seeing him the night before.
When I came home, my young husband and I had been out to dinner, and we walked up on the porch. And at that time, the windows were open. The screens were there, but the windows were up to let the breeze in. And I heard my father on the phone, and he says, "I don't care what you say. You killed my brother, and I'm not gonna rest until that is proven." And so we went on into the house, and I said, "Daddy, what was that? Who was that?" "Oh, baby, don't worry about it. We'll talk again later." And that was the last conversation I had with my dad.
With Martin's assassination rocking the civil rights movement to its core, many did not accept the lone gunman theory, and no one was more interested in discovering the truth than Martin's brother AD. Now, 50 years later, we will re-examine the journey of these two brothers and the mysterious death of AD King. Was it an unfortunate accident or a murder intended to obstruct justice? More Unsolved History, Life of a King, when we return.
He said, "They tried to choke me to death in that gym with my necktie." I said, "Oh, Mel, I said, I'm so glad that they did not choke you to death." I said, "because we have such a great loss."
Welcome back to Unsolved History, Life of a King. When we left our story, it was 1968, just after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. But what led to that fateful moment started long before the trip to Tennessee, long before the nation knew the King name. Martin and Alfred were born into a family with a legacy of leadership in the advancement of colored people. January 15th, 1929, Martin Luther King Jr. is born in Atlanta, Georgia. Just 1 year later, July 30th, 1930, his brother, Alfred Daniel Williams King, is born. The two boys spent their early years in the now historic family home at 501 Auburn Avenue with their oldest sister, Christine.
Well, we had a rather normal childhood, like sisters and brothers. We stayed together, played together, got into trouble together.
AD and I met in junior high at David T. Howard. He probably would recognize more. His daddy was a very famous minister, at that time. We just do what, teenage kids would do at that age. Well, we used to like the girl, used to run at the girl.
So we met at the YWCA party when we was like 12 and 13. And I think it was 1947 when my mom and I joined the church. So at that time, we sort of, developed a serious relationship, and we became, like serious girlfriend and boyfriend.
February 25th, 1948, Martin is ordained at Ebenezer Baptist Church just before graduating from Morehouse College. Meanwhile, A.D. still attending Morehouse discovers his longtime girlfriend, Naomi Barber, is pregnant with their first child.
So we went and had a talk with Daddy King. He said, there will be no abortion, there won't be none of that. He said, I know you're in school, it's your first year in college, and AD is in college. He said, but it won't be none of that. He said, we're gonna have this baby.
Naomi and A.D. would marry on June 17, 1950, and their daughter was born just 7 months later, the first of 5 children.
I was the oldest of 5, the firstborn in my generation. And so Daddy he was a great father. He was just a great dad and very protective, a wonderful provider.
September 1st, 1954, Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King marry and move to Montgomery, Alabama, just 1 year before the historic Montgomery bus boycott.
To me, it happened so fast. When the movement started, I can remember when it started in 55.
A.D. and the family visited Martin after he was arrested in Montgomery.
And he said, you know what? I said, what? He said, you know what? He said, they tried to choke me to death with my necktie. I said, what'd you say? He said, they tried to choke me to death in that gym with my necktie. I said, oh, ML, said, I'm so glad that they did not choke you to death. I said, because we'd have such a great loss. You know, I just don't even want to think about that. So I think in that moment, that's when I began to have my first thoughts about the civil rights movement and where it would go.
In 1959, A.D. graduates from Morehouse College and finally embraces the ministry and the movement, even knowing the danger involved.
The student movement here in Atlanta was well integrated with SCLC, probably more so than anywhere else in the country. But A.D. was the leader of the group, and there were 5 of us. I think everybody was student except A.D. But one of the rules, of course, is that you don't never take any weapons with you. So when we were arrested, he said, get rid of everything. And I did not get rid of my little knife that I used to sharpen pencils. So when we got to the prison and they searched us and they found this little knife, they said, okay, we're gonna put you in the hole. The hole was that place where they put the worst prisoners in. And so and it was A.D., strangely enough, who had advised us not to have anything on us. He's the one that really pleaded with them not to put me in the hole. And they listened and they did. So I ended up going in with everybody else. So that was my first memorable experience with A.D.
For years, A.D. worked in his brother's shadow as an organizer and a detail man.
A.D. King had as much commitment, if maybe even more commitment, than his brother Martin. He was willing to work with us on the committee. He was very actively involved. He was at ITC at the time. He was on the first sit-in. He was there on the committee. He participated, worked hard, picketed, you name it.
By 1963, A.D. was living in Birmingham, pastoring the First Street Baptist Church in Inslee, putting him center stage for the biggest battle in the civil rights movement thus far, Project C.
He was one of about 4 preachers that, along with Fred Shuttlesworth, invited us to come into Birmingham. Out of 400 churches, there were only about 14 churches that would let us meet, and his church was one of them. Inslee also produced a lot of the high school students that ended up creating the movement that changed America.
With Martin's previous success in Montgomery with the bus boycott, joining forces with his brother A.D. for Project C in Birmingham could prove to be a powerful recipe for a big national change, a change that much of the country would not be prepared to face, turning the small city of Birmingham to the crime-riddled town of Bombingham. More Unsolved History, Life of a King, when we return.
He said, Naomi, it's too quiet here. Something is not right.
And he picked her up and started running through the house. Get out, it's a bomb.
And when we looked back, the whole front of the house was gone.
Welcome back to Unsolved History, Life of a King. It's now spring of 1963. Martin and the leadership of the SCLC knew a victory in Birmingham could bring a much-needed jolt for the civil rights movement. They would call the plan Project C, C for confrontation.
A.D. King, he was one of about 4 preachers that, along with Fred Shuttlesworth, invited us to come into Birmingham. He went to jail in Birmingham with his brother.
Seeing A.D. as one of the leaders in the movement by being the brother of Martin Luther King Jr., but really being his own.
It would begin on April 3rd, 1963. It would build in waves. First, a boycott of downtown businesses, then waves of sit-ins at white-only establishments to fill the jails, and finally, nonviolent protest marches on a daily basis.
And it was A.D.'s members who basically came the height of the movement there in Birmingham because he was able to get there and give leadership.
It was great. I served here under him as the finance chairman, and then I served as the youth director. He would get me to stay in the house inside while the other guys guard the house. But that was in case of something happened, I would be able to help get them out, you know.
My main role was bonding people out of jail. I bonded as many, over 50 people at one time.
On April 12, 1963, A.D. was arrested along with his brother and Ralph Abernathy.
They was determined to get the Kings. I know that.
Ensley also produced a lot of the high school students that ended up creating the movement that changed America. And that was A.D.'s leadership.
The police also arrested over 600 young people, but 1,500 more stood in the shadows ready to march the next day. With the jails filled and the economy hurting, Police Chief Bull Connor used excessive force to clear the streets. This would set the perfect trap to bring the heavy-handed reactions from police face to face with the national media. With the United States under the global spotlight, President John F. Kennedy sends in federal negotiators on May 5th, 1963. Just 5 days later, Martin, A.D., and Fred Shuttlesworth sign a truce known as the Birmingham Truce Agreement. In exchange for halting the protests, white business owners promised to desegregate their shops, lunch counters, and drinking fountains.
Facilities, lunch counters, and fittings.
But with this victory came immediate retaliation.
May the 11th, 1963, my husband came up to the front of the home, and he said to me, he said, "Naomi, it's too quiet here. Something is not right."
And he picked up and started running through the house, get out, it's a bomb. My brother jumps up off the couch, and the rest of us were in the back.
First explosion, the concussion knocked out the window. The concussion was so forceful, I saw my mom and dad fly by my bedroom. That stuff they do on TV ain't nothing like the real thing.
And we get out of the house, and then we run out through the garage.
And when we looked back, there was a second bomb, and the whole front of the house was gone.
That night in the street, this whole street, all this area was full of people. I mean, in every direction, and they just came. I don't know if it flashed on the news. I don't know how people found out so fast.
That same night, dynamite explosions had ravaged the Gaston Motel, a black-owned establishment where Martin Luther King Jr. had been staying. Fortunately, he had already left town, and no one was hurt.
There was a man by the name of Roosevelt Tatum. He said that there was a police car parked right in front of the home over here. And he said he saw him toss the first bomb.
And when we got to Avenue H, one policeman was standing in the yard. And where he went to after then, I do not know when the people started gathering.
And as people were driving up and down the street, the people honestly for a minute began to riot. They began to pick up stones and debris and throw at the cars. And my dad said, we're nonviolent. Do not retaliate.
May 12, 1963, President Kennedy issued a statement. Disturbed by the bombings in Birmingham, he ordered 3,000 U.S. troops to encircle the small community to bring an end to the rioting and gain some semblance of peace. With the battle lines clearly drawn, taking the fight for civil rights to Washington was the only option left. More Unsolved History, Life of a King, when we return.
The integration of housing, people could go live where they want. That was AD's baby. But Dr. King pulled all of us into Louisville to help with that open occupancy march.
Welcome back to Unsolved History, Life of a King. While the country is dealing with the aftermath of Project C, images of young black children being hosed down in Birmingham are flooding the evening news and the morning papers. The civil rights movement gains even more momentum, leading to the social, political, and financial framework for the March on Washington. Held on August 28, 1963. Organized by A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, it sets the stage for Dr. Martin Luther King's most famous speech. The speech would come to be known as the I Have a Dream speech, a speech aimed at the Emancipation Proclamation, signed 100 years earlier in 1863. He called it, quote, a bad check written to America's black citizens.
And I think this march will go down as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, demonstrations for freedom and human dignity ever held in the United States.
Finally, less than 1 year later, President John F. Kennedy and the nation's Congress responded.
Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act.
Before this proposed legislation would be signed into law, President Kennedy was assassinated.
The greatest leader of our time has been struck down by the foulest deed of our time.
July 2nd, 1964, AD was by his brother's side as newly sworn-in President Lyndon Baines Johnson signs the Civil Rights Bill, keeping Kennedy's promise.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions. Divisions which have lasted all too long.
1965, AD moves his family to Louisville, Kentucky to pastor Zion Baptist Church.
In 1965, Reverend A.D. Williams King, Dr. King Martin's brother, he called a meeting of black preachers, and he invited me. And that's when he asked us to organize to join SCLC, Southern Christian League, Dr. King's group.
The focus of the new chapter of SCLC would be open housing.
I know the housing efforts that we have here in the country today, the integration of housing, people could go live where they want. That was AD's baby.
After years of meeting and negotiating with city leaders, AD and members of the SCLC took to the streets protesting day and night at government official homes and offices.
But AD started a movement on open housing in Louisville. And that movement really is what set up the Chicagos to do what they had to do, or the Philadelphias and the Clevelands.
April 13, 1967, 27 marchers were arrested for ignoring a court order against demonstrating after dark. In the scuffle, AD was hit in the eye with a rock and beaten.
We plan to return tonight to the South End and continue our march nonviolently.
With the story gaining national attention, Martin Luther King Jr. and members of the SCLC shifted its resources in support of the open housing movement in Kentucky.
Dr. King pulled all of the staff out of Chicago. I was in Chicago working on in the slums, open housing stuff in Chicago. But Dr. King pulled all of us into Louisville to help with that open occupancy march, where we was able to get people that AD had befriended, like Ann Braden and others there in Louisville, Kentucky, whites who basically worked hand in hand with us in the southern city.
AD, being a master strategist, just needed one big moment to push the open housing issue over the top. And with the Kentucky Derby fast approaching, they set their sights on a major disruption.
Dr. King, did you come to Louisville to watch the horses run on Saturday?
Well, that has to be determined. I have not had a chance, as my brother just said, to meet with the leadership.
After the Ku Klux Klan promised to combat any disruption of the Derby with violence, the Pegasus Parade, traditionally held the day before the race, was canceled for the first time in 55 years.
So you're going ahead with plans for Saturday, is that right? This is not good enough to have you cool things off?
So we are continuing as we have planned, yes.
In other words, physically, you intend to stop the running of the race?
Well, I'm not at liberty to reveal methods at this time.
The next day, with the National Guard present, AD and the SCLC opted for a smaller demonstration on the day of the Derby that did not disrupt the race. With the two sides at a standoff, the only way forward was through legislation.
The most important bill that year was time. Half the Senate was for daylight savings time, and Tom was for daylight savings time. The other half was for central time, the rural legislators. He'd ask me, how you gonna vote on time? Tom, I don't care what time it is. I said, you take this roll call sheet, and everybody you got committed to vote for daylight saving time, you get them to vote for open housing when it comes up for a vote. He said, what? I said, that's the deal. He snatched it, went off. About 3 hours later, he came back. He said, here. He had it. I said, now I'm going to vote for daylight savings time.
The passage of the open housing ordinance in Kentucky sparked other states to follow suit. Next, A.D. Martin and the SCLC set their sights on labor. Soon, they were invited to Memphis to help sanitation workers already on strike.
He was, with my brother Martin in Memphis when that tragedy took place.
Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated April 4th, 1968. He was only 39 years old.
Certainly I am saddened by it, but on the other hand, I am very proud of what they did because they stood up for what they believed in, regardless of the outcome.
The nation reacted quickly to the assassination of MLK, and riots swept the United States. As tensions swelled, the newly sworn-in president, Lyndon B. Johnson, faced some perilous choices, as did Martin's brother A.D. King. And those choices may have led him to his own demise. More Unsolved History, Life of a King, when we return.
He knew more than perhaps he should have known about his brother's death.
He knew what could be ahead, but it never made him stop.
Welcome back to Unsolved History, Life of a King. After Martin's assassination at the Lorraine Motel, there was a massive public outcry. Angry protests, tears, and riots. The newly sworn-in president, LBJ, reacted to the black community by exercising his political capital, urging Congress to pass the Fair Housing Act.
I signed a message to the Congress. That message called for the enactment, and I quote, of the first effective federal law against discrimination in the sale and the rental of housing in the United States of America.
If civil rights and voting rights were Martin Luther King's legacy, housing rights would be the legacy of Alfred Daniel King. A Pyrrhic victory for the civil rights movement, while Martin's killer still roamed free. June 8, 1968, James Earl Ray is captured in London after 2 months on the run.
How could James Earl Ray, who was an itinerant crook, never had much money, could arrange to kill King and then somehow or another have the resources to get out of Memphis, get into Canada, all the way over to Britain, without any money and help from anybody? I mean, how do you get out of Memphis? It had to be a private plane somewhere.
AD was not accepting of the lone gunman narrative in Martin's murder. Sensing a larger conspiracy at hand, AD began to dig, and what he found may have gotten him killed.
AD was determined to get to the bottom of who killed his brother, that he, one, was unhappy with what he had learned about his brother's death. He knew more than perhaps he should have known about his brother's death, and was determined to try to keep the issue alive.
My father loved his brother, and he supported him fully in everything. They did everything together. And so I believe that my father knew, I'm with my brother, we started this together, and it will end with us.
Do you have any indication that you might take a more active role in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference since the death of your brother?
Well, definitely, yes.
If both brothers look alike, sound alike, have the same message, if one is taken away, you can't leave the other. That was exactly what happened with President John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. And he knew what could be ahead, but it never made him stop.
The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was not just one man, my brother. It is a group made up of many people.
August 26, 1968, AD's church, Zion Baptist, was bombed in Louisville. Fortunately, no one was hurt.
Well, I've talked with the officers of my church and also the director of safety of the city of Louisville, and I understand that it was some pretty bad damage.
By the fall of 1968, AD would leave Louisville to return to co-pastor Ebenezer Baptist Church with his father, Martin Luther King Sr.
I think AD really never quite got over his brother's death, and neither did his father. And even though AD came on to be the associate pastor at Ebenezer and was a very good preacher, it was hard for them to get over the death of Martin. And then shortly after that, his mother was killed while she was praying the Lord's Prayer in church on Sunday morning. So the tragedy of the family is just overwhelming.
On July 1969, AD would walk his daughter down the aisle on her wedding day, unaware that this family gathering would be his last.
I had been married for almost a week. My dad walked me down the aisle as a young bride. And it was a special time because it was in the midst of the tumult of the civil rights movement. And I heard my father on the phone. And he says, I don't care what you say. You killed my brother, and I'm not going to rest until that is proven. It was that type of conversation. He was talking on the phone. Now, we had become accustomed in our family to the phone ringing, and we were having death threats and all of that. Our home had been bombed even in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. So I was accustomed to rough telephone calls, but that one was a little different because Daddy was very confrontational with that person. He's, you killed my brother, and I won't rest until the truth is told.
The evening of July the 20th, we was laughing and watching TV, and I went to sleep. Don't remember what time it was, late in the evening.
July 21st, 1969, as the nation awoke to the news of the Apollo 11 moon landing.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And I woke up the next morning, he was in the bottom of a swimming pool.
Alfred Daniel King was pronounced dead in the backyard of his Atlanta home.
I was there on the scene when they pulled him out of the pool. He was doubled up in a fetal position with some bruises around his abdomen. I heard the EMT say there's no water in his lungs. This man was dead before he hit the water. I know what I saw and I know what I heard.
At the time, his wife, Naomi King, was on vacation with Coretta Scott.
We were in Jamaica at the time on vacation with Coretta and two of her children. And my husband and I were two of our children were there. So he had to leave to come back to Atlanta for church participation.
Family, friends, and SCLC President Ralph Abernathy came to support the family.
It's just tragic that this family has had to undergo so much within the last few months.
Along with Dr. Ralph Abernathy, Reverend A.D. King was carrying on the work of Martin Luther King, Jr. A.D. King was behind the scenes for the most part, but he was important to the movement, partly as a symbol of continuity. Now he is gone, and there are no more sons of Martin Luther King, Sr. to carry on his work.
As news spread of A.D.'s death, all official reports stated he drowned in his swimming pool and that there was no foul play.
It certainly was suspicious circumstances around it. When you consider that the next door neighbors, who at that time were white, suddenly disappeared, I tend to not think that my uncle drowned on his own in his own pool. I mean, he was a very good swimmer.
The state of A.D.'s body would become the only evidence to counter that theory. Unfortunately, no autopsy was ever done.
I met an investigative reporter, Jeff Pugh, and Jeff was out of California at the time, but he came to Atlanta after the funeral, after Daddy passed away, and we tried to get the records of the death, the records from the coroner, and we tried for months to get them, and we got the runaround. Oh, the coroner didn't have time to write everything down. He was used to keeping things in his mind, and now he's dead, or it should be on microfiche, but we can't find it. We had just a runaround for months, and so we were never able to get the records.
I think that people didn't want to know the truth, as they didn't want to know the truth about Martin Luther King. There was a investigation into Martin's passing. Really was never much of an investigation.
Questions that have been unanswered to this day that most people have forgotten, but I will always have that suspicion in the back of my mind that A.D. went to the Lord just like his mom and just like his brother, with somebody else's involvement.
When you get farther away from it, you begin to ask questions, but we don't have many definitive answers, and perhaps never will.
It sounds to me as though it requires some looking into and some investigation, because the man was all of a sudden found dead lying in the swimming pool. That whole thing is very, very strange. I would urge A.D. Williams' family to think about seriously exhuming the body and trying to get the truth out of it. The technology today is such that I think a lot of information can still be made available.
With all the mystery surrounding A.D.'s death, will his family seek to open an investigation or leave the puzzle of his passing unfinished? More Unsolved History, Life of a King, when we return.
And that I'd have to have somebody who was willing to do work on my behalf, somebody who was willing to stand up to the horses and the tear gas and the billy clubs.
Welcome back to Unsolved History, Life of a King. When Alfred Daniel King died, the same media and press the movement used so effectively to get attention for their civil rights movement in the past barely covered the story. Was this by design or pure coincidence? A.D. would die on the same day of the moon landing, the one day that all Americans were looking to the stars and nothing on earth would make a blip in the news, making the King family's greatest weapon, freedom of the press, powerless on a day they needed it most, crushing the legacy of A.D. King in the process.
My heart bleeds because my illustrious husband is not here, and all of that, the causes that he gave his life for, his belief, his hard work that he indulged in, and not to be able to have any acclaim to all of the hard work that he has done and put forth, and to be back at this point now without him, I feel a terrible injustice that he is not here to get his dues, his props.
What happened to A.D. is not unusual. We live in a symbolistic society, okay? Symbols. Martin King punched all the buttons until he was shot. That made him immortal.
People, unfortunately, try to compare one with another, and that's unfair. A.D. made a great contribution in his own way, and he should not be compared to his brother.
Although the contributions of A.D. King are not as well known as his brother Martin, his legacy will not be forgotten.
Well, I think the most important thing is the housing piece that we have today, integration. Folk can live where they want to live. Had that not ever been an A.D. doing that in Louisville, Kentucky, leading that movement, getting beat up, we wouldn't have open housing today. Another piece is the breadbasket movement that Dr. King started here in Atlanta. Had it not been for A.D. and Fred Bennett, all of those preachers from across the world wouldn't have never got together to integrate a lot of these businesses. Coca-Cola wouldn't be what it is today had it not been for people like A.D. and Fred Bennett.
Operation Breadbasket was one of many departments formed by the board members of SCLC. While operated by Fred Bennett, A.D. was behind much of the strategy.
We boycotted a lot. So if you couldn't buy from a colored vendor, you bought no gifts, no presents. There were seasons when if you could not buy your food from a colored vendor, then you bought no food.
Those guys went to A&P and told A&P, if you don't give us jobs, then we're gonna go somewhere else and start shopping. These companies didn't just get kind and good. It was folk like A.D. and Bennett and those other preachers who brought that together, and that's the best thing that folk need to know, I think, about A.D.
The SCLC is now made up of chapters and affiliate programs all over the nation, expanding on the life's work of Martin Luther King Jr. and his brother, Alfred Daniel Williams King.
The work of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference will never be over. In my book, I was saying that I hope that because I got beat up and went to jail once or twice, that my children wouldn't have to. And then I stopped and I said, no, that's wrong. I said, I hope they don't have to go to jail for the same things I did, but I hope they will always find something for which to fight.
You know, I was down in Selma, Alabama, celebrating the 42nd anniversary of the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and I was surrounded by folks whose names aren't always in the history books. I was reminded that they had marched for me. They didn't know me. I was only 4 years old at the time. They didn't know who I was individually, but they understood that there would be somebody like me coming along, that I might want to do something with my life, that I might want to be a lawyer, that I might want to be a law professor, that I might want to run for the United States Senate. I might even want to run for president, and that I'd have to have somebody who was willing to do work on my behalf, somebody who was willing to stand up to the horses and the tear gas and the billy clubs.
Although A.D.'s death is still a mystery, and Martin Luther King's assassination is shrouded in conspiracy, their contributions to this nation will never be forgotten. I'm Ed Gordon, and that's all for this edition of Unsolved History.
As we pledge ourselves to eternal vigilance of our just cause, let us establish the militancy in Martin Luther King's words, and I quote, "Some of you have knives, some of you have guns, and I ask you to put them up. Some of you have arms, and I ask you to put them up. Get the weapon of nonviolence, the breastplate of righteousness, the armor of truth, and just keep marching."